Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Inside HR. I'm James Marsh. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our discussion about how artificial intelligence, AI, is changing the way organizations assess talent. Today's webinar comes to you in partnership with Qt, an Aon company, and I have a panel of guest experts with me who will be guiding us through this topic over the next hour. Before they do, there are, of course, a number of ways in which you take part in our webinar this morning using the range of buttons and tabs that you can see underneath your slide deck on your screen. You can ask questions via the Questions tab. You can vote in our polls, the first of which will be launching very soon. You can rate the webinar, and we really do value your feedback when you do that. Thank you so much for doing that. And you can access a range of links and resources, as always, with Inside HR relevant to the topic that we're talking about this morning. Today, behind that Attachments tab, you've got 2 white papers and a fascinating article from a magazine called Raconteur as well. So please do go and access those because they really do help inform around the topic that we're going to be talking about this morning. I'm going to allow my panel to introduce themselves this morning. So who have we got with us today?
Hello. Hi, James. So my name is Sarah Keenahan, and I am a work and organizational psychology consultant with Qt. I'm part of our enterprise solutions team, so my main responsibility is designing solutions to address the requirements of our clients. And I am part of the VidAssess project with AI project team. So very excited to be with you today.
Fantastic. We're excited to have you with us, Sarah. Thanks very much. Who else have we got with us today?
Hi there, this is Oke Brandt calling from Hamburg. So I'm a product development consultant within Qt and Aon Assessment Solution. And I'm working with Sarah actually, so I'm mainly focused on the AI solution with our tool VidAssess at the moment.
Fantastic, Oke. Great to have you with us. And last but by no means least, the guest who's going to be talking mainly about our case study this morning. Who else have we got?
Hi, I'm Amber Harris. I joined Qt actually in January. Previous to that, I was an in-house recruiter for 12 years, so more used to listening to webinars and taking part in them. But I worked for Marks & Spencer. We had, over 200,000 applicants for some areas and 2,000 plus for experienced hires. And I actually introduced Qt to M&S, and I loved the concept of AI, so I've moved over to join them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Amber. So that is our panel today, and I know we're going to be talking a lot about Amber's 12 years with Marks & Spencer later on as well. If we take a look at our agenda this morning, it's an exciting one. As always, we're going to set the scene first, talk a little bit about the context of artificial intelligence and how that's changing the way HR and business operates in 2019. We're then going to talk very specifically about talent assessment and then about hiring before we, as we've said, talk about Amber's experience with Marks & Spencer and how AI was a huge influence in what she did there. We're going to have a quick panel discussion and Q&A session at the end as well. As always, we set aside time on Inside HR to answer your questions. But we're going to dive straight in, and I'm going to turn to Sarah first, just to sort of talk very generally about AI, what it is, and what we're talking about this morning in context.
Yeah, thanks, James. So I wanted to start off this webinar with a quote from the Google CEO, Sundar Pichai, who once said that AI is more important than fire or electricity. And I think it would be quite interesting to see how Google, or any other company for that matter, would try to run their AI without electricity. But I think he is making a very valid point here. AI is becoming increasingly important across all industries. And consultancy firms like Accenture have predicted a 38% revenue boost for companies who embrace AI and other digital technologies in the next 5 years. So while you may not agree that it is more important than electricity, there is absolutely no doubt that harnessing AI is going to be vital to ensure the long-term competitiveness of any firm.
Absolutely, 38%, that's huge. So before we do that, before we talk about how that's possible, I think there is a need for us first to talk about what AI actually is, because it's a buzzword that's generated a lot of interest and debate, but I'm sure there is a huge population out there who probably just need that defining very clearly in terms of which we're going to talk about it today, Sarah. So what does it actually mean? Sorry, Oke, I beg your pardon. I'll bring Oke in instead. Yeah, so Oke, just talk a little bit about what AI means to you.
Yes, of course. So yeah, as Sarah mentioned, it's coming up in every kind of business field actually, that people talk about AI, and also in every part of life. So no matter if you talk to Alexa or something like that. And it seems like AI is just popping up in the recent years, but actually it has been around for quite a long time. So the first time that the term artificial intelligence actually popped up was in the 1950s. And yeah, actually what it describes is quite a broad field. So it describes the academic discipline of designing machines that demonstrate intelligent behavior. So obviously that's pretty broad, even if you think about, okay, what is intelligent behavior, that needs to be defined, obviously. But if we take a little broader aspect here, that's cognitive technology, which narrows it a bit down. So this is actually the application of AI to simulate human experts and their behavior, for example, in problem detection, in problem solving, and in decision making. Based on some sort of knowledge representation. So it's basically what happens with human as well. So if a human gets some kind of input, so some visual input, for example, a human would usually reach back to some kind of knowledge that you have gathered over years and would then decide on what action you want to take based on your knowledge. So basically what AI does is pretty much the same. But obviously it needs to learn or gather this knowledge beforehand so that it can actually predict something or come to a conclusion or something like that, which is happening through machine learning, which is also a very important term within the field of AI. So basically machine learning is basically applied statistics pretty much. So what it does is that it looks at input variables and connects output variables, for example, via a regression, or just looks at pattern in a certain input or something like that. So yeah, that is basically what we understand under AI so far.
Brilliant. And so AI is basically that, as you described, the same as that human process where we have input, we access knowledge to produce then an output or an action. Oki, so that's really well explained. Thank you for doing that. How does that then get used in talent assessment, which is our topic today? What solutions are out there at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, AI has been around a long time, and we at Qt have been using it for quite some time already. So we've been using it for 15 years. And even things where you would probably not think of AI in the first place, they have quite complex intelligence algorithms in the background. So if you want to do a talent assessment online, you obviously cannot track what your applicants are doing, and you cannot control the situation. So you need to come up with a solution, in this case with algorithms, to have a counterpart to, for example, faking or cheating. So if we look, for example, at item generators, these are a very good example actually of AI and cognitive technologies. So, for example, if we look at our personality questionnaire ADAPT, it is constantly looking at the answers that you have given so far, and with every new answer you give, it generates a new knowledge base, and based on this knowledge, it gives you the next item. So the item is not just generated one by one, but it actually looks at what you have said so far, and then gives you the next item so that you can actually improve the accuracy of that, to get the best results. And another example, what we've been using for quite some time already, are report generators. So when we think about narrative reports, they can be quite exhaustive and quite long. There's lots and lots of intelligent algorithms in the background that actually take different variables into account to give the perfect narrative report to the candidate in the end. So these are just some things that we have been using already in the past time. But we are working right now on more complex stuff actually, which counts to scoring 2.0 kind of, where we look at unstructured data. So what we had so far is more kind of structured data. So there's, for example, cognitive tests that were right or wrong answers. But nowadays we have, for example, a lot of video data or chat assess, which we use, where we can get a lot of unstructured data, and we are now able to use this data to come to some kind of predictions. And some examples, one I already mentioned is ADAPT, and we'll also talk about Sparks later on, because that is quite interesting in terms of unstructured data. And also one of our newest features is the AI augmented video interviewing.
Wow. So an artificial intelligence that can sort through that kind of data is quite new and really exciting. Why, Oki, is there a new sort of increased interest in AI now?
Yes, that is basically due to the technological development that we have experienced in the past decade, I would say. As, for example, the hardware is getting better and better, and nowadays it's so cheap to store data on the cloud, for example, that we have just tons of data lying around somewhere. And it's just so cheap to store it. So we have big data here. And obviously to come to some kind of prediction or to use this data, we also need very sophisticated hardware to analyze it, which is available today. And we have way more complex and intelligent algorithms that are able to, for example, understand the language, which has made quite some progress in the last years, and it's very important for new solutions in talent assessment.
Brilliant. Thank you for summarising that, Oki. Apologies to our audience if Oki's line sounds a little bit poor. We are working on that at the moment. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to launch our first poll and get you involved in this now that Oki set the scene. So we're asking the question, what is your biggest concern with AI in talent assessment and selection? Is it A, potential negative candidate experience? Is it B, resistance to AI from within your own organisation? Is it C, the difficulty implementing AI tools? Is it D, ensuring a fair process that's free of bias, which is something Oki just touched on just now? Or is there another reason, option E, any other reason that's preventing you from really embracing AI and talent assessment in your organisation? So please do get voting. That vote is open now by clicking on the vote tab that you can see next to your slide deck on your screen, and we'll bring you the results of that shortly. Amber, I guess speaking to that question in terms of our audience's biggest concerns with AI and talent assessment and selection, when you worked at M&S, what was your biggest fear as a recruiter towards using some of these AI assessment tools that Oki's just described?
I think the initial one would it work? And it did. The science was behind it. It was better than recruiters, even me, and I was a good recruiter. But it was, it didn't get tired at the end of the day like a recruiter would. It could work 24/7, so candidates could apply when they needed to, and it was probably cheaper than a real person when you've got big numbers involved. So that was, it absolutely worked, and that's why I'm a massive fan of AI. I think at the time, would it replace my job? People don't talk about that, but the reality is when you are a recruiter and you start to think robots are doing what I used to do, it's a concern. Reality is you get to do what you should be doing, so you get to do more of the strategic things. You can work on attraction, application, making sure that you've got the best selection and making sure the onboarding experience is good. So, what tends to happen is you spend your time with the candidates that you really want to see, because AI is actually screening out the ones that aren't going to be right for that particular role. The other thing was what would candidates think about it? And they loved it. And I'll tell you why they loved it, because it was a quick process. So most, I think the feedback we used to get from candidates at M&S is, you can have really short time to hires, which I'll talk about later on. But if you can get through the process quickly and they know it's a fair process, that's what they're looking for. So those were the three concerns, and, having used AI, there's no issues at all.
That's really interesting. So there's concerns from almost sort of two perspectives. One is the internal recruiters themselves and the concerns they have around using AI, and also the fact that it might make them obsolete as well. And then the other is that candidate experience too. So we've got a slide up on the screen here about what AI can mean for your business. From a recruiter's perspective, Amber, what did AI do? What did it mean for you and your business?
Well, it reduced the time to hire. For anywhere where you've got thousands of candidates applying, and that could be just 1,000, or it could be 200,000 plus for some of the schemes that we were running. But it reduces the time to hire. You're not going to lose your candidates to competitors, and the lead to getting somebody in front of a hiring manager is going to be much, much quicker. So hiring managers are going to be happy as well. Manual processes take a lot of resource, so to be able to switch it on to something where it's moving it through quickly is a benefit for everybody.
Fantastic. And some of the other benefits as well, we've talked about time saving. There is a huge cost saving as well that you touched on earlier.
Yeah, so, well, I'll probably go back a little bit. On the enhanced screening, I think one of the real benefits of AI is some of these tools now allow you to really promote your brand as well. So if you're using something like ChatAssess, where candidates can see a little bit about the job that they're going to be doing and find out a little bit more about the company, that allows them to probably deselect themselves if they're not right. So that's why, the screening is good. And that saves you money, because if you're not bringing people through that are not right for the business, then you're going to, obviously the cost savings are going to be huge there, especially if they're not going to take the time up of a hiring manager. And then you're not going to get the negative feedback from a hiring manager saying, why am I seeing this person? The AI is doing all the bits that it should be doing for you. So
it enhances screening. Sorry, Amber. So it enhances screening. There's a huge cost saving to have as well. Let's just touch quickly on that bit that scares everybody, which is that decision-making process, the idea of turning decision-making over to artificial intelligence.
It works. If you're buying the right thing, it absolutely works. And, we'll talk about video interviewing later on. But it's doing what it needs to do to screen out, to get, to make sure the right people are not coming, and not being taken up an assessment or an interview, and even worse, being employed. So decision making, and if it's going through AI, you can start to do validation on all the data you're getting, and everyone's talking about data now. How can we make things better? So for me, you can look at what types of candidates are applying. Should you change your attraction process? All of this data is power, as they say. So it really enhances the decision making there.
And just lastly, as you already touched on, this presents your brand in a totally different way to potential candidates, doesn't it? So it changes your brands to almost, you have now to think about your own digital employer brand as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, some people are concerned about, certain businesses, are they going to be there in 5 years' time? And if you're the clunky older recruitment process, I think people start to think, oh my goodness, where am I going to, what sort of company is this? Whereas if you've got something that is innovative and forward-thinking, it certainly means that you're putting the right sort of message out there to people that are potentially going to come and work for you. So definitely enhances your brand.
Yeah. So, Amber, you've obviously had a really good experience with AI, with M&S, and AI generally well received within the industry. But, Sarah, it's not uncommon, is there, as we just talked about, for there to be a lot of fear around AI and for its public perception, its media perception maybe, to be not particularly good. Why is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think adverse reactions to AI are so common, like you said. And oftentimes they're made worse when you have thought leaders like Elon Musk claiming that AI is a fundamental risk to the human existence. So that kind of puts a bad spin on it. However, using cognitive technology to augment and improve human decision making isn't uncommon. I think a really good example of this is the ABS systems in cars, the anti-lock braking systems. Mm-hmm. So if you think about you're driving on a wet road, which is quite common in Ireland where I'm based, and there's an obstacle on the road and you hit the brakes, the moment that your wheels lock up, your car's ABS system is going to take control and release the brakes again. But in this instance, you have a machine overriding a human's action. But in this case, you would be thankful that the ABS stepped in and saved your life, rather than questioning whether it's what risk it has to the existence of human civilization. If cars aren't your thing and you're more into music, if you think about the life-changing for me anyway, Spotify AI algorithm that creates your Discover Weekly playlist, this improves your decision making by linking you to amazing new music that was chosen specifically based on you, based on your previous inputs as well. When we think about why there are these adverse reactions to AI, I think that they're caused by two main drivers. One of these being a perceived lack of transparency around how AI actually works, and another being an absence of a really clear use case. So we know that AI is potentially useful, but how do we leverage this, particularly in HR, and implement this technology to achieve real return on investment? During the webinar today, we're going to delve deeper into these two issues, so looking forward to getting into detail on that.
That's really fascinating, because it's such an interesting point that you make there, that actually, when we hear the term AI, we tend to get an adverse reaction. But if we think of places where that's already been implemented, whether it's music, whether it's cars, whatever, it's actually something that's been broadly very welcomed by both consumers and organizations that manufacture or produce those services or products. So that's a really good point to make. Let's bring you the poll results now. So remember, we asked, what is your biggest concern with AI in talent assessment and selection? Was it A, potentially negative candidate experience? Was it B, resistance to AI from within your organization? Was it C, difficulty implementing AI? D, ensuring a fair process that's free of bias, and I know we're going to talk about that a lot more shortly, or was it another reason? Just 6% opted for another reason, so we've got the four main reasons up on the screen. It's interesting, guys, really interesting mix here. Just over a third, 34%, talk about ensuring a fair process that's free of bias. That's their biggest fear with AI. 22% talking about the difficulty of implementation. It's quite complex in their minds. 20% saying their biggest fear is the potential negative experience for the candidate, with 16% saying resistance to AI from within the organization. Oki, if I can turn to you first, that's quite a sort of even split across all four of those major reasons why people aren't adopting AI in talent assessment, or their fears around doing so. What's your reaction to that? That obviously shows that all four of those reasons are major players in this discussion.
Yes, thank you. It's quite interesting to see the results. We've run the same questions before in another webinar and saw quite similar results, actually, with ensuring a fair process free of bias as the most important point in these concerns. And yes, obviously, it's always important to have a critical view on what you're doing there, actually. And obviously, it's very, very important in the talent assessment to have a fair process free of bias. And that is actually something that Sarah just touched a little bit. The most important point here is to be transparent and to actually open up what you're doing with the AI, so that you don't hand over everything to the machine, but you understand how the machine works and what it's actually doing. And obviously, we have run a study with candidate experience, actually, of AI raters. And what we have learned from that study is that familiarity actually enhances how candidates accept AI scoring. And obviously, this goes with transparency as well. If you educate your applicants about what is happening here and how you come to a conclusion, that will actually help in your processes.
Okay, so absolutely. So let's focus on AI in talent assessment. And as you said, Oki, Sarah did mention that problem of transparency and why that's relevant to us in talent assessment. We've got something up on the screen here called the boxing dilemma, which is a sort of visual representation of that. Just talk us through what that is up there.
Of course, yeah, thank you. So what we see when we talk about using cognitive technologies in many use cases is some kind of a black box approach, where you cannot really see or understand what the machine is doing, and that is quite common for using neural networks and machine learning techniques. Because what you usually do is that you have some certain input, for example, a response to a question, and you give that to the machine, and you also give the output data, which could be a criterion, for example, if someone is hired or not to the machine. And then the rest is left over to the machine. So the machine connects the input and output layer, and you don't really know how it does it. So it takes certain variables and put them to the output variables, but you cannot see how it did that. You don't know how it actually came to a certain prediction. And obviously this is not sensible, and you cannot really do that in a talent assessment approach, as you want to show your candidates why it did come to a certain conclusion. And if you cannot justify it, that's obviously not a fair process. What's also not happening here is that you are usually looking for clones, because the machine would always give you kind of the same person. So you have a familiarity bias in there. And this bias actually is a diversity killer. So that's something that usually companies do not embrace too much. So what we would do instead of that is open up that black box and turn it into a glass box. where we understand what is happening here and actually track what the machine is doing and how it's coming to a conclusion. So instead of using criterion data such as hired or not hired, we will use the approach of taking concepts as a basis, so that we rather look at, okay, what are the concepts that we want to look for, and how can we actually teach the machine to look for these things. So this is really important, just because a machine operates autonomously. It does not mean that we cannot control it. It's just really important to be careful with it and to kind of look what the machine is doing and have a clear, trackable process in this context.
That's really interesting. So because AI operates autonomously, people often mistakenly interpret this autonomy, meaning that humans actually can't control what it's doing, and that's obviously not true. Can you give us an example of this in use, Oki?
Yes, of course. So one of our tools that has quite a complex algorithm behind it is Sparks. So Sparks is basically a creativity assessment that's part of our innovation suite. And the candidates in this assessment are asked to come up with a certain picture. So they get 4 different shapes that they can use to form any kind of picture they want to and give it a name. So as you can imagine, this is a lot of unstructured data, which I've mentioned before, because the candidates are free to use any kind of shapes and put them in different sizes and rotate them and stuff like that. So they can basically come up with whatever they want and name it whatever they want. But what we are able to do is actually with using intelligent algorithms and also using an API to Google, so an interface with Google, is that we can actually figure out, okay, is this actually a valid and creative idea that the candidate presented here, or is it pretty basic? So, for example, if we talk about a picture that is called pig, that is also obviously not too creative, but if you call it a pig wearing a hat running into a house, that is, well, maybe it's not useful, but at least it's innovative. It's something new that most people wouldn't come up with. So what we do with this assessment is basically that we mimic objective human rating of creativity. So it's quite an interesting assessment. Another one that we have, which is also a very good example, is ADAPT. I think Sarah can tell us a bit more about ADAPT.
Yeah, so ADAPT 15 is our adaptive personality questionnaire. And what it has in the back end is a really complex algorithm that controls for both social desirability responding. So that means that both options will be equally appealing to the candidate, so they can't game the test. And it also pairs for cultural response bias, which again is really important for when you're looking at diversity and getting rid of any kind of unconscious biases. So our adaptive algorithm will determine the items that are paired together based on candidates' previous responses. And this creates a more challenging test for the candidate, but it also reduces the amount of time required to gather really insightful data on candidates' behavior in the workplace. It's also automatically scored, so that generates significant time and cost efficiencies, and again removes any unconscious biases that could cloud the decision-making during the recruitment process. From a candidate perspective, this adaptive algorithm produces a really positive experience because the assessment takes less time to complete. And for recruiters, this obviously means higher completion rates, but it doesn't impact the insights generated for recruiters when they're making decisions. There are other tools that use this adaptive technology in innovative formats to generate these efficiencies and eliminate bias in the recruiting process. So for example, if you look at our Smart Predict suite, which is the screenshot on the left, this is a gamified cognitive ability assessment. And we have found that these assessments can predict performance across many industries. And we found that high scores are twice as likely to be rated as above average in customer interactions, but also that candidates find these assessments really engaging, with 96% of users describing that they are motivated to do well. So again, it's about driving candidate experience, driving completion rates and increasing the diversity of your talent pool by doing that. We also have our Chat Assess tool, which is the one on the right. And this is a situational judgment questionnaire, but it's delivered in the kind of format of WhatsApp. And this has a branching logic, which means that the responses will differ depending on what the candidate has sent back as a message. We've seen global completion rates of 96% for this assessment, but what we've really seen is how it can contribute to our clients' diversity strategies. So we have one client that works in the engineering industry, which is typically quite homogenous, generally dominated by white males. And after we introduced this Chat Assess tool, we saw a massive 83% increase in female candidates in their applicant pool, and a jaw-dropping 210% increase in ethnic minority candidates in their applicant pool. What's really important about these assessments as well is that they're all mobile first and created in the HTML5 environment and using responsive design. So that means that candidates are able to complete the assessments on a device of their choice, which is obviously really important for if you look at like social mobility, because it may not be that every candidate has access to a laptop, but majority of candidates now have access to a smartphone that has access to the internet, so they can complete the assessments on their mobile.
Sarah, that's fascinating. It's really interesting. The diversity and inclusion aspect of this that we hadn't really touched on before is such a huge driver, and we've spent a lot of time on Inside HR over the last year doing a whole range of webinars on different diversity and inclusion issues, and AI wasn't mentioned once, which I think is really, really interesting. So thank you very much to both Oki and Sarah for giving us that synopsis there. Just quickly, an answer to a question that's come in, and please do send us your questions. We've got 10 minutes at the end to go through as many of them as we can. We're already getting a few in. Thank you so much to the people that have done that. There is just one that's popped up on my screen that missed the names of those programs there. So Oki talked about Sparks, and then Sarah talked about Adept 15. So you can look those up, and there are links behind the attachments tab as well, where you can go onto Qt and Aon's website and find out more about all of that. Before we launch further on, we're going to launch our second poll. And ask you another question on the back of what Oki and Sarah have described there, which is, where do you think AI has the biggest potential to improve the recruitment and selection process, maybe in your organization specifically or generally? So do give us your views on that. Option A is it will speed up the process. Option B, it'll mitigate human bias, which is what Sarah just touched on now. C, it provides better information for decision making. E, lower cost of assessment and selection process, so a cost focus there. Or is it, as we asked earlier, another reason that we've not listed as part of those four there as well? So does it speed up the process, mitigate human bias, provide better information, or lower the costs? Please vote accordingly, and we'll come back to your responses in just a few minutes' time. But now we're going to focus very specifically on video interviewing, which is something that Amber mentioned earlier, but it's a really important part of this. We've already reached the context of interviews where AI can be applied. But to find that sort of sweet spot for where an interview for where AI can be used for the benefits that Sarah described earlier, we need to understand what's happening at the moment. So I'm going to turn to Oki again. Oki, just quickly remind us how a structured interview process looks like at the moment, the aspects that belong to that interview.
Yeah, certainly. So what is really important about structured interviews is that there's lots and lots of evidence that it's actually valid, and that it can enhance your hiring processes so that you can get better applicants and better employees. And what you usually do when setting up those kinds of interviews is that you first of all obviously have a look at the position and the job requirements that you have. And you use these requirements to define competencies that you need to overcome these requirements and be good at your job, obviously. So that will be the first steps. When you then have identified the competencies that are important, you should come up with a set of questions that actually tackle these competencies, so that you can ask them in the interview to the candidate and see what they are saying about that. And what you should also do beforehand is to define positive and negative indications of evidence, so that you, during the interview, can quickly see, okay, is this applicant actually fulfilling these competencies or rather not? So then you invite your applicants, and they come maybe to your office or something like that, and you ask them the questions. And then what you do is usually, as an objective rater, is that you look for clues and for indicators for these competencies. So, for example, if you ask someone about a situation where he had to work in a team, and this candidate tells you something about, I did not talk to any of them, that's probably quite a negative indication. But if he says, well, I talked a lot to them, gave them feedback, we shared information, these would be, for examples, for positive indications. So you kind of listen to what the candidate is saying, and then you kind of tick the clues that you have seen there. After the interview, you would basically rate the competencies and give a score, and then you would come up with a recommendation. So if this candidate is good for this or not.
Fantastic, Oki. And Sarah, the process that Oki just described, how does that work with video interviews, particularly ones that are sort of asynchronous, ones that, you know, you're having to take all that data and put it all together? How does it work with video interviewing?
Yeah, so I think the concept of it is the same. So you would start off as well with your setting up of your competency model, and you'd also look at those positive and negative behavioural indicators. You then design your questions based on these competencies, but this is a really important part, particularly in asynchronous or one-way video interviews. Because if you think about it, you're not going to have the opportunity to probe the candidate during the interview. So if they go off on a tangent, or if they don't answer the question properly because they've misinterpreted it, you're not going to get good quality data from that. So you have to ensure that the questions you're asking are going to elicit the content that you need to properly assess the candidate. Then once the interview is live, the candidates will go through each question and they'll upload their video responses. So generally we would give them some preparation time. So you present them with the question, you give them maybe 30 seconds preparation time, and then you would limit their response time to maybe 2 minutes or 2 minutes and 30 seconds, so they don't feel like they have to spend their life talking, go off on a million tangents. As a last step then, candidate responses are going to be rated and reviewed by the trained raters. And this is based on, again, the behavioural indicators that you find in their speech content, so in the content of their responses and what they've said.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about AI, how AI contributes to this process?
Yes, of course. So as we have now the recordings of the candidates, we can use this data and analyze it with AI in this process. So what we do is we want to look only at the speech content, because this is where we can find the indications for the competencies. So what we do is that we split up the video and audio and send the audio to a machine, to an intelligent machine, which transcribes it and turns it into text. And what we do afterwards is that we analyze this text with a trained machine, where we have predefined constructs. So we trained the machine beforehand based on our psychometric knowledge we have in Qt, to find certain indications for traits and constructs. And then we send the text to the machine, and it will basically show us, okay, we have positive and negative indication for certain traits, and will give us a score. So what we can see here on this slide, for example, is the transcript, where we can find different indications, for example, for the trait structured or cooperativeness, and also positivity, where we have positive and negative indications here. And this is basically the same as a human would do. So you look at indications and come to a score at the end for a certain competency or trait.
Fantastic. Thank you, Oki. Amber, I want to turn to you. Before we talk about the impact of video interviewing, we asked our poll question a short time ago, and audience, please do remember that you can still vote in that poll. Remember, we asked, what do you think AI has the biggest potential to improve in recruitment and selection? Is it A, speeding up the process, B, mitigating human bias, is it C, providing better information for decision making, D, the lowering cost of assessment and selection, or is it another reason? So please do keep voting in that. Already lots of you have, so thank you very much for doing that. But before we focus specifically on video interviewing, your time at M&S, and how, just tell us a little bit about how AI improved your recruitment process.
Well, it did all the things you mentioned. I mean, if you think when we now advertise jobs online, which means we get a huge number of applications. If you were doing it you'd need a huge team to get through the amount of screening that AI can deliver for you. So by the time you actually got there, you'd probably lost your candidate to somebody else. So it definitely speeds up the process. In fact, some of our roles, we didn't even need CVs. We were very much looking at things from a behaviour. So that definitely removed the bias. So we had a nice, diverse group of people that were working for us. And obviously the cost involved in, AI and computers pushing candidates through quickly means you don't have to have a huge team that are just going through CVs. You know, I've been in recruitment a long time, and from when it started, where you had a filing cabinet that were full of CVs, and where it is now, it's much more sophisticated, but it works much better. And, the pass rates at the assessment after going through a process that involved AI were better than they were previous, because, you weren't looking for mirror images of what you thought you needed. You were being able to look at people's behaviours and how they were doing the job, and then when they got in the job, would they be able to do it quickly?
Sure.
So AI helped with all of that.
Fantastic. And more specifically about video interviewing, which Oki was just talking about earlier, during your time at M&S, what impact did video interviews have?
Well, see, video interviewing, it's come a long way, but it's going even further. So, I would sit there some days doing 20 to 30 interviews, and it started off face-to-face, then it went to telephone interview. But with telephone interview, the problem with that is you had to fit in with the interviewer's schedule, the candidate's schedule, and sometimes you'd be speaking to someone and very, very quickly you realise they weren't motivated, or their communication wasn't sufficient enough for the role that, you were recruiting for. So you were wasting your time and the poor candidate's time. So moving it over from a telephone interview to a video interview was a massive plus, because you could do it when you needed to, and the candidates, if they're working in retail, they might be on lots of shifts, so they could do it when they got home. But where it's going now, I'll be honest with you, when I first heard about the concept of AI in video interviewing, I was a bit nervous.
Sure.
But then when I actually looked at what I was doing and picking out particular words that the candidate said, so for example, if they were talking about their time, planning, and they were talking about, they used the word prioritising, that this is what AI does for you. So the advantage for me on video interviewing and where it's going now is that it can help me fast track candidates. If you've got an assessment centre coming up very, very quickly and you've got 50 people that you need to, be able to review, it can tell you the ones that you should focus on first and probably screen out the ones that you really shouldn't be spending your time on. So it just does what a recruiter needs. Otherwise, we'd be sit up till like midnight, still going through lots and lots of video interviews. And the fact that, with video assessment, you can actually start adding on, ability or aptitude tests as well, just takes it to the next level, so that your assessment conversion rates are even higher than they could be by just doing video interviews. So really exciting.
That is really interesting. And Oki, if I can turn to you quickly, that focus on speech content that you talked about earlier, it has a lot of benefits, doesn't it?
It does indeed. I mean, that's what should happen in an objective, structured interview. That you ask a question and that you're interested in the response to the question itself, and nothing else should count at that moment. So that you actually look at the indicators that a candidate is giving here, and look at the behavioral situation that you have there. And then this makes it actually defensible, because you can explain why you came to a certain conclusion, and it makes it more transparent to the candidate as well. And so it's quite important to focus on the speech and content, because this is the information that you want to use to come to a conclusion in the end. And it also helps you reducing the bias, because you're asking about something, and only looking at that makes it more sophisticated in the whole process.
That's interesting. So focusing on speech content, Sarah, if there are other things that we can focus on with a video interview, as well as the actual words that they say, there's also their expressions, their facial expressions, and there is a call for perhaps facial and expression recognition software to be used for scoring purposes. What do we think about that? I mean, we've thrown up a picture on the screen here of a very cheerful chap who has a lovely facial expression. So if HR were to use facial and expression recognition software for scoring purposes, how would that go?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting question, and it's one that we thought about extensively and considered when we were defining and training our AI algorithm. I'm going to be a psychologist now for a minute and say when we think about facial and expression recognition software, we have to really think about what it's actually measuring. So for expression recognition, its focus is to measure a state. So a state is a temporary behavior or feeling that is going to depend on your situation and motives at a particular time. So an example of this is this lovely happy chap, and that we can see on screen at the minute. But how does this temporary state of happiness reflect his personality trait? And a personality trait is a much more stable and enduring characteristic or pattern of behavior. So does a worried expression mean that you're fearful, or does a happy expression mean that you're really friendly? I'll leave that up to you to decide based on our example here. But in the research literature, there's lots of studies that show that facial appearance or expression of emotions do not reflect personality. And that's what we want to assess when we are looking at people's suitability for a job. It's the long-lasting behavioral traits that are going to predict their performance. And these have been found time and time again to be really predictive of performance in the workplace. And while facial recognition software, I think that's going to become more useful as it progresses and becomes more sophisticated, probably in terms of verification and proctoring. So during online assessments, making sure that the person who is meant to be taking the assessment is taking it and you're verifying that. But in terms of using it as part of an AI algorithm to score video interviews, we need to really carefully question and examine the additional benefit that it would bring before we start to implement it.
Sure, absolutely. I can understand that, especially if you were contemplating hiring the cheerful chap that we had on the screen there. Now it's time just quickly to bring your thoughts back in to our audience with their poll results. So we've just shut that second poll where we asked, what do you think AI has the biggest potential to improve in the recruitment and selection process? And again, guys, we're seeing quite a sort of a split across those four listed options that we gave, plus obviously an option for any other benefit there. 31% saying it'll speed up the process. So speed and efficiency, a big part of what they think the biggest improvement's going to be. Something that Amber talked about a lot there. Better information for decision making was 30%, 28% that it will say it mitigates human bias, and just 10% saying it's about cost, which is actually, I'm guessing, guys, quite encouraging. So, Oki, only 10% of the audience talking about the cost, with the rest all split between seeing those benefits in terms of speed, in terms of mitigating bias, and in terms of providing much more and much better quality information.
Yeah, quite interesting to see. I mean, all of them are quite connected a little bit as well. I mean, if you speed up the process and you don't need, as Amber mentioned, a whole team to review all the interviews, for example, that also lowers your cost usually. Also quite interesting to see so that many people voted for mitigate human bias with regard to the poll we had before about concerns to ensure a fair and unbiased process. So we see people are concerned about it, but they also see the benefit that it is possible to mitigate the human bias. And I think that's what we want to take in here as well, so that if you do the glass box approach and make the process transparent, that you're actually able to mitigate the human bias, especially by looking only at the speech content and not too much on the visual cues, for example. And obviously provides better information for decision making. The data is there, we have it available, so it can actually obviously help you to improve your processes. You just need to analyze it the right way, so that you don't have any bias in there, that you embrace diversity actually. So I think this pretty much sums up the best points of AI and the biggest potentials here.
Fantastic. And Sarah, just talk us through some of the benefits as you see them, for example, in video assessment and selection.
Yep. So there's so many benefits, and I think we've touched on them quite a lot today already, that both video assessment and AI can bring to your recruitment process. I think they ultimately boil down to three main areas, that being cost saving, process efficiencies, and an increase in the validity of your measurement and the validity of your prediction. So obviously your cost savings are achieved through reduction in both the time spent having to conduct costly face-to-face or phone interviews. With AI, you see the real process efficiencies in the reduction on time spent scoring and screening unsuitable candidates. And like Amber said, this is really important because it allows you to create more meaningful touch points with key talent that you want to hire and retain in your applicant pool. For candidates as well, it provides a better experience as there is a reduction in the recruitment process, decisions are made more quickly, and you kind of eliminate the frustration that can sometimes be accompanied by what seems like an endless wait for an update on the recruitment process between stages. But yeah, I think I'm kind of in agreement with the audience in thinking that the kind of elimination of bias is one of the most important things that AI is going to deliver. Because our AI is trained to mimic the behavior of a highly trained rater and a highly trained and unbiased interviewer, it increases the validity of measurement and prediction compared to traditional phone or video interviews. And it's going to be a really key driver in industries or jobs that have a homogenous workforce. So I just wanted to bring through an example that we have done in the aviation industry. So I'm not sure if you know this, but globally only 5% of pilots are actually women, which is a really small number. So we've worked with clients to leverage AI in their recruitment processes. And I just want to highlight some of the outcomes that we achieved by introducing it. So we conducted a study with an airline client, and we applied AI in the selection of cadet pilots as part of their video interviewing. And we had a sample of over 6,000 candidates, and we found that our AI algorithm delivered a 98% accuracy in emulating expert interviewers. So this demonstrates how powerful and accurate this tool is. In terms of the cost and time efficiencies that we've talked about, they eliminated the need for 6,500 interviews, which was a saving of about €1.3 million for one recruitment process, which is massive. These outcomes are really good, but I think what our client was happiest with was the knowledge that there was going to be a significant reduction in the bias that they saw during the interview process, and it allowed them to drive their diversity It's allowing them to drive their diversity strategy and increase the diversity of their workforce, which is really, really important.
Fantastic, Sarah. Thank you very much for taking us through that. We've just got a few minutes left, and I want to devote all of those to Amber to tell us a little bit more about how AI was used at Marks and Spencer's. Your 12 years of experience there, Amber, and you've talked about how M&S started to use AI for that recruitment and selection process. Just talk us through the details of how that worked.
Well, as I said, they've been using AI for a long time, and a lot of the retail competitors were in complete admiration that M&S could have such a small time to hire. And some of that is obviously with a good ATS. When you're dealing with 200,000 applicants, you need a decent ATS. But if you've got a selection process that allows you to screen out the people that aren't right, but bring in a really diverse group. If you've shopped at M&S, you'll see we've got people of all different ages from different backgrounds, probably, and some of them have never worked in a store or something like that before. So it allows you to attract huge, huge numbers, which they've done really successfully. And the quality that they get at the end of it is what makes M&S, what it is, when it focuses on service. So if you look at things like Glassdoor, candidates love it because it's quick. They find out whether they've got a job really, really quickly, and recruiters love it because they're not spending all their time looking through CVs. And, it's not just applicable for, the store level staff, because we're using video interviews for, managerial roles, using personality types of assessment for experienced hire, and certainly with the graduate early careers, there's lots of things that M&S are trying out now, which is one of the reasons I came across Qute.
Sure, and that was going to be my next question, Amber, just before we go into the questions from our audience. What's the future for M&S now? What's the next step in terms of their using AI in their selection?
Well, one of the things that's great about M&S is that they are very, they talk about being forward-thinking, future-focused and digital first. They've got partnerships with Microsoft, and so they need to really, make sure that their recruitment process is reflecting that like it always has. But I think now it's probably a case of updating, making things, even quicker than it was, because, when they introduced some of the assessments, it took longer to complete, whereas now, we introduced Qute's Chat Assess Walk for their early careers recently, and that just makes the process far more exciting and maybe even fun for a candidate to complete, which is brilliant. I've watched some things with M&S recently where they've done assessments and the candidates have, they've done the online, gone to face, and they've come away thinking this is a company that is really, forward thinking, and they mean business, which is fantastic. Obviously, with video interviewing, the more AI you can put behind it, and the more you can speed up the process, then naturally they're going to be looking at that sort of area as well. But for them, it's about keeping ahead of the game. So things like videos, simulations, virtual assessments. It's naturally, now I've come over here, I've got lots of colleagues at M&S still, and I want the best, for M&S, so I will be, talking to them about what they can be doing going forward to fit the brand that they're pushing them to be. So exciting stuff.
Fantastic, Amber. Thank you so much. Now we've got 5 minutes left, and we're going to devote all of that to the huge number of questions that have come in over the last 55 minutes. Thank you so much for sending those in. So we're going to put our panel in the hot seats now and get them to answer some of these. There's some really, really interesting stuff across a whole broad range. Sarah, perhaps the first one to you is about the gamification that you talked about earlier. The question says here, the gamification suite looks good, but again, how do these products approach senior exec level roles? They're statistically older, the candidates. They're of an older generation, possibly less receptive to these technologies. They've been interviewing face-to-face and doing written assessments for selection their whole lives. How, at that sort of C-suite executive level, does this go down, and how can companies make it work for them at that level?
That is an excellent question. I think I'll start off just with giving you a nice little statistic. So before I started doing research into gamification, I always thought of the typical gamer as like my 18-year-old brother sitting playing the PlayStation all day. But typically, the average gamer is actually a 35-year-old woman, and that's because of the advent of things like Candy Crush and those mobile games and mobile crosswords and other kinds of cognitive games that people are playing at the minute. So in terms of senior executive level assessment, we've seen quite high uptake with them because they're familiar with the format, and because they're so engaging and enjoyable, it doesn't really feel like an assessment. It's they're really great, and we've seen them used there quite well as in your early stage graduate talent.
That's really interesting, and there was another question about that as well, which talked about maybe at that level it's not a case of efficiency because you've got a huge swathe of candidates that you need to get through quickly. It's not about that sort of bulk that we're talking about, because you might only have a short list of 3 or 4 people for that particular role, which is interesting. There's another question come in here, we talked about diversity and inclusion a lot, and I think it's a really interesting question. Perhaps Oki, maybe you can answer this one, and Sarah as well, do come in. And Amber, with your thoughts as well. How do you think AI identifies and reacts to individuals with physical disabilities? We talked about video interviewing. We talked about recognition software. We talked about all those things. Is it fit for purpose for people who may present very differently to the standard, the average, whatever that is, candidate? Perhaps someone with different physical difficulties. Is the system able to cope with that?
As far as I understand it, it definitely should be, because we still keep the approach that we want to get the speech content. So, obviously it depends on the disability they have. If, for example, disabilities to speak clearly or something like that, then the machine might struggle to understand the candidate the right way. But we have some indicators that actually show us, the machine was not able to rate this candidate due to certain reasons. So we'll give some kind of a flag. so that a human could actually review this interview and have a closer look at this person and see what he or she thinks.
Fabulous. And Amber, can I just put that to you as well? How was that an aspect of the system you used at Marks and Spencer's? And also, actually, if you wanted to touch on how they deal with executive, more senior hiring at M&S using AI as well.
As far as, to be honest with you, I think most of my candidates for video interviews, there weren't many issues at all. And if there was somebody that had a disability that meant they couldn't use it, I would just take it offline and do exactly the same thing. But it was a major issue. I mean, even with people whose English was their second language,
sure.
You know, you were, as long as you were able to understand what they were saying, which they would have needed to if they were coming in as a manager role and inspiring their team. But so for AI to be able to do that would have been fantastic for me. In regards to experienced hire, I think that, you know, again, you know, when you work for somewhere like M&S, you've got some roles where the pool of people is tiny, but you still want to be able to put them through something like an adept personality interview to know what their areas are for development. So if you've got 10 people and they all can do their particular role well, you're then matching them to whether they fit your culture. And some of them, even if they don't fit everything 100%, what can we do to make sure that they're going to want to stay within that culture doing the job that we're actually advertising for? So, yeah, so I've talked a lot about volume because that's where the obvious cost savings are. But if you take on an experienced hire and they're the wrong one, that costs you a fortune.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. We've run out of time, and I want to finish with just one last question. I think maybe, Sarah, I'll bring you in for this one as our last one. It's a really fascinating one. How does your panel feel about tackling the issue around AI demonstrating bias as a result of pre-existing bias on historical data or from existing employees? So both channels where an AI program will be pulling its data to develop frameworks, but it's data that existed before the process. So an example of this was Amazon scrapping their AI selection tool last year after it mistakenly taught itself that male candidates were preferred for their tech roles, because historically they had been, which is a really interesting take on it. Sarah, I guess it's all about the quality of the data that you're using for this process, but just talk a little bit about how AI reacts to pre-existing data and where that data's come from.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think it goes back to our kind of focus on the speech content. So we focus on what the candidates are saying, and we can trace that back rather than using demographic information. When we're training our AI algorithm, we train it using multiple highly trained raters from different demographic groups. So that then eliminates the familiarity bias that would have been found in the Amazon algorithm. And it's, again, being able to link it back to behavioral indicators that are predictive of performance in the role. And that's our approach, and that's how we've kind of eliminated that.
Fabulous. Thank you, Sarah. Guys, we've run out of time. I'm so sorry. We could have gone on for a lot longer. We've just got time to remind you about the attachments. Please do go behind and look at that. My thanks to Sarah, to Oki, and to Amber for their insight this morning, and we hope we have them again here on Inside HR. Inside HR is back on Thursday, the 4th of April, again with Qute, where we're going to be talking about recruitment reloaded and talking a little bit more about AI in recruitment. But until then, from everyone here at Inside HR, have a fantastic few weeks. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.